The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's webinar, Delivering the Value of Partnering, Inspirational Leadership in Supply Chain, with guest speaker Stephen Hanman. This webinar will provide information on inspirational leadership to partner with 3PL or supplier that will add strategic advantage to your supply chain. Understand your current supply chain relationships internally and externally, who is worth partnering with and how to do it. Identify workplace culture and organisational system challenges in moving along the partnering path. This is an interactive webinar and Stephen will be asking questions and answering questions throughout. If you'd like to ask your question directly, please raise your hand function and I will unmute you and invite you to speak. Alternatively, please type your question in the question box and I'll ask it for you. You will be placed on mute throughout this presentation, but if you're having any problems with your connection or display, please use your question or chat function so I can help you out. I'm now going to pass you over to Stephen Hanman and he'll start the presentation.
Thank you, Wendy. As you introduced, today we're talking about delivering the value of partnering via inspirational leadership in the supply chain. And I've put together that topic because partnering is something that's known about, and it was probably popular 10 years ago, but the reality is that it only happens a little bit, and it only happens a little bit because it demands some inspirational leadership to get partnering and collaborative ventures off the ground. So that's what we're going to talk about today. As mentioned, looking for expectations, and I'll come back to those for people who have filled those out. So as a picture of the whole, this is part of a Supply Chain 2020 program that I created that has 3 parts to it. The first part was about where supply chain management is going to be in 2020, and it was about cultural aspects in terms of the development of more interdependence in organisational life, to the degree that a seamless supply chain with no silos may be the outcome that we start to see more and more of in the next 5 to 10 years. The second part of this program was the development of a high-performing team, and in there was about emotional intelligence and the development of that emotional intelligence. And the third session is about partnering with a third-party provider and inspirational leadership. We're going to talk about as a precursor to the pursuit of partnering. So let us begin with an idea that, you know, what role does partnering really play in the world of a world-class supply chain? And for most world-class supply chains, they think in this interdependence. So rather than independence of each of the different departments or service providers and suppliers, they tend to work far more intimately with them. They tend to have less rather than more. So that second paragraph is about how the number of suppliers that a company engages with has reduced significantly. And one of the measures for that is that the focus is now on the task, the strategic task, rather than the transaction and rather than the price. So it's become a more strategic activity. And just one example, Linfox, I'm aware their strategic intent has been to reduce their customer base over the last 3 years from 300 customers, and they now have less than 100 customers. And that's inferring that they need to work deeper with those 100 customers, and therefore they need to work in some way in a partnering model to enable that relationship and their business. So it's something that's been going on, but one of the challenges for organisations is to establish who to partner with. And then to get the value from that partnering relationship. Okay? And there's an internal challenge, which is how to create the culture that actually enables partnering to blossom. And my work in organisational development and supply chain development sees a very direct link between the types of partnering relationships organisations have and the level of inspirational leadership within those organisations. And if we talk about a third-party logistics provider and a client, I see both sides of that relationship responsible for inspirational leadership. Often it's easier if the client asks the third-party provider to be involved in a partnering relationship, because obviously as the service provider they say yes, but the service provider also needs to work in collaboration and partner with the client. And both sides of that equation are, I believe, responsible for the lack of partnering that goes on. And that's some of the we're doing. So let's look a little bit more into inspirational leadership. And the reason why is because partnering is not easy, and it's an expensive process, and it's actually not for the faint-hearted. You do need to have some courage to step out of the normal transactional adversarial relationship to one that's more strategic, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Research tells us that the rewards can be great, and it's partnering, I think, is a reflection of what will become the norm, because we're now living in a very complex, connected world where we can't do everything and we need others to be successful. So this idea of interdependence is becoming more and more critical in organisational life. So as I said, it needs a little bit of courage to step out of what, or beyond the norm of polite, transactional, sometimes adversarial relationships. And to do that, you need a measure of inspirational leadership. So to introduce inspirational leadership, what I'm first going to do is just talk about emotional intelligence, because inspirational leadership is one of the 12 competencies detailed in the Hay Group, Daniel Goleman research, and also in the product offer by Hay Group on ESCI, which is Emotional and Social Competence Inventory. And I'm an accredited ESCI person, so I do emotional intelligence with people and develop their emotional intelligence through a range of coaching processes, of which one is inspirational leadership, which I'm sharing today. So just to recap, emotional intelligence is broken up into these 4 areas: self-awareness, other awareness, and self-management and relationship management. The idea is that with better relationship management driven by each of those other 3 emotional intelligence areas, we can actually deliver high performance sustainably without burning people out, and it can be fun and good for people. So if we look at those 4 categories, they break down into these 12 competencies. So the first one is emotional self-awareness. It's by itself, and there's 1 competence. There are 4 under the self-management, and what's interesting is that the second one, achievement orientation, is very much driven by whether you do what you say, whether you deliver what your aims are in your own performance plan. So it's very much driven by results. So it's surprising that emotional intelligence has such a strong focus in that area. So in addition, we've got adaptability, emotional self-control, and a comment about emotional self-control is it doesn't mean that you're a robot. You need to be able to express your emotions so other people know what's going on. And very important. So the third area is social awareness, and that's broken up by 2 competencies, which includes empathy and organisational awareness. As we'll see, empathy often ranks very, very low in organisational life. And the last area, which has 5 competencies, is in this relationship management area. Incorporates conflict, the capability to work in conflict and resolve conflict, to be a coach and mentor, which is like a leadership style, your ability to influence people, which is once again a leadership style, inspirational leadership as a competency that impacts on you, your team, your area, the organisation, and lastly, teamwork. So one of the challenges there, and what we see with emotionally intelligent people, is that they're capable of not being triggered into action. They're actually aware, emotionally self-aware of what pushes their button, and they can have their button pushed but not respond out of that moment. I was watching something about one of the Buddhist monks, and they were talking about the monkey mind, which is always going. And emotionally intelligent people find innovative ways to meditate just simply by breathing or going for a walk or getting themselves out of that reactive mindset. Might be simply breathing. But the challenge with emotionally intelligent people is that they can see the consequences of their actions, and so therefore can see more of the system in organisational life, which makes them more capable of being what they need to be to get the outcome required. So moving on, one example of some emotional intelligence work that I've completed with a client. You can see those 12 competencies on the left-hand side, and you look at how many individuals had those strengths. So in this group of 12 people, no one had emotional self-awareness and no one had empathy. Achievement orientation was high, emotional self-control was high, and teamwork was high. So a mix of competencies, and as a group of people, they identified that the most important thing for them as leaders of a supply chain, of a multi-billion-dollar supply chain, was inspirational leadership. Only 2 of the people had those as strengths, and so that was the #1 priority from the group. And as you can see, followed by emotional self-awareness, and then developing the capability for empathy. And so I designed a program for this group of people whereby we could develop people's inspirational leadership, and that's what we're going to talk about. So in the A group ESCI process, these are the 5 questions that are asked around inspirational leadership. And what I did was then develop that up to another level and just created some questions that allowed each of the people to respond and to identify whether they're doing it all the time and giving themselves a 4 out of 4, or whether they're doing it some of the time or none of the time. And I developed 24 questions here, and over the page I've just highlighted number 16 there, which is the need to be open and transparent. So inspirational people often don't surprise anybody, and you can actually predict what they're going to be because they've got some emotional intelligence and they actually think through what they need to be successful. To take someone on a strategic journey like a partnering relationship, for example. Continuing on with the rest of those questions, and now I provide these questions so you may be able to, after this webinar, actually document where you think you're at with inspirational leadership. So you'll get a copy of these slides, mark yourself out of 4 for each of the questions, and actually see how you go in terms of your own inspirational leadership, and your scoring may then tell you what you need to work on. And I'm very happy to interact with people if they'd like to put some focus in any of those areas. So, as an example, this group of people that I mentioned before in the case study, they all filled out that diagnostic, and the results were that the average score was 75%, and there was one person who rated themselves 98%, and interestingly, that person was the only one who was an inspirational leader in the emotional intelligence 360-degree survey result that those individuals and team received. There were 2 people in the 60s and the rest were in the 70s. Now, this is a group of people who are leading a few thousand people. So inspirational leadership is actually a critical competency for these leaders. So once again, you may calculate your score and look at what you can do, because the interesting aspect here is that the inspirational leader of this group of people was actually my client in a collaborative or partnering venture with a third-party provider. And that's what we're going to move on to now. So you've got to be inspirational leader to take on a partnering relationship, because it demands of you something different than the average day-to-day, because you need to be able to work with other organisations and be able to maintain constructive relationship while there will be very difficult challenges in the process. So it needs some inspirational leadership to be able to hold that partnering relationship to deliver long-term value to both organisations. And the reality is sometimes one person may have a little bit more capability and they may actually hold the relationship. So it might be a client who works with a third-party provider and they actually maintain the partnership relationship, and over time people within the third party develop competency around emotional intelligence who then step into that partnering relationship. So there is a dynamic there. It's not black and white. It is a dynamic system that actually plays itself out. So to look at, why would we go and partner? And the reason is because there's value to be captured with some strategic suppliers. And what we're going to talk about is an idea whereby we look at the business drivers, the value of your organisation to be in partnership with someone else. And that's driven by, one, the business drivers and the value, and two, whether you're actually going to be capable of being in partnership with someone. So that means they're similar to you, culture, style, size, geography, etc. So the source of this research is the Supply Chain Management Institute, and there's a guideline called the Partnership Facilitator's Guide, and the author is Professor Doug Lambert, who some of you may know, but it's about developing and implementing successful partnerships in the supply chain, and I've been using it for about 10 years. So the question here is for each organisation how to work out who they should partner with. And what I've done here is just provided an example of a technique called product portfolio analysis, which actually just breaks up your supply base into these 4 categories based on the percentage of spend in dollars and then the strategic risk to the business if the supplier fails. And typically what we're looking at are people in this 4th quadrant, which is high risk and high spend, and they're sometimes the showstoppers. If that supplier actually fails, it has a dramatic impact on your success. And they're the sorts of organisations that you need to have more strategic relationship with, relationship that may have 5 or 6 levels to it. So there might be a CEO connection and a director level and senior management, middle management, and then process workers, for example. Now, just by me saying that tells you it's going to be expensive to be in relationship to these people compared to someone in box 1, which is totally transactional, there's no risk and it's low spend. You go to the shop and you buy it and there's no relationship. So that's where you've got to link the effort you're going to put in to develop a partnership relationship with the value you can get out. So you can go away and look at that product portfolio analysis and identify some suppliers that you'd like to be more strategic with. And so once you've done that, you can apply this partnership model which comes out of the Developing and Implementing Successful Partnerships in the Supply Chain by Doug Lambert. And what you do is once you've identified an organisation that you'd like to partner with, and that can be you the client or you the third-party provider, invite them to come to a workshop, and the challenge is to identify the strategic drivers that are your compelling reasons to partner, and we'll go through these in a little bit more detail. So each organisation does the drivers separately, and then together they do the facilitators. And they're the things that will make this relationship a partnership if there is value as determined by the drivers and the facilitators together. So in the middle there, number 3 is a decision to create or adjust the relationship, and it may well be a type of partnership. And we'll come to that in a moment. But the whole idea of working out whether we've got the right relationship is then expanded into the number of components and the types of components that we need that nurtures this partnering relationship. And obviously the whole idea of doing a partnership is to get value from it in your organisation. So point 5 is the outcomes, the extent to which performance actually meets expectation, the link between whether the drivers identified at the beginning are actually right and delivering that value to you as an organisation. And I've been involved in a number of these relationships whereby we start with identifying drivers and then being able to measure the outcomes based on the components developed. And obviously there's a feedback process that reviews the drivers and the facilitators. So just a little bit more detail. Strategic drivers we've done individually. We do the facilitators as a group. That determines the value. That then determines the type of relationship we want to pursue. And then we can look at the types of partnership components that we need to implement to get that value promised. And that then identifies the types of sharing of resources and collaborating. And I've got there obviously from master servant to process flow amongst equals. And one of the questions that came out of the expectations was the need to develop a level of trust early on in the process. And that's absolutely critical. And we'll come to that as we proceed through this webinar. And like everything else, we need to be able to measure success. We need to have joint ways of understanding success of the partnering relationship. And obviously it needs to be working for both organisations if a partnership will continue long term. So here's one example of a project that I've done, and you can see that the drivers equate to 20 for the third party provider and 18 for the client, and the ones that are to the right of those 4s indicate the possibility of a strategic advantage in this area if we develop a partnership relationship with this other organisation. So what this told us was that from a driver perspective for both organisations, opportunity was significant in terms of value. If we then look at whether our organisations are similar, we look at the types of facilitators that are presented, and you can look at those categories down the left-hand side as it was for the drivers. And once again, the facilitators is a relatively high score, and then what you do is, so a summary, the drivers for the third-party provider was 20, for the client 18, for the group facilitators it was 20, and that gets plugged into what's called this table, which has the driver points, so 20 and 18, that both lives in the right-hand side in the yellow type 3, bottom right. And then if we look at facilitators, which is 20 points, that also lives on that bottom line. So this process identified that these two organisations, if they developed a partnering relationship that used all the components that we're going to talk about, there would be a type 3 partnership and strategic value to both organisations. So the challenge then was for these two organisations to deliver that value to both the organisations, and that was the relationship journey that I was with them, and I was the strategic collaboration broker, in effect, keeping them both on track. So as I said, we work out the type of relationship. That it tells us what sort of planning components that we need in the relationship to deliver the value that has been identified. So these are the 8 areas that both organisations then work on what type of planning, what sort of joint operating controls, communications, risk and reward sharing. So there's a continuous improvement focus from both organisations. How much trust and commitment do we need for this relationship to deliver the value promised? What sort of contract style? How will the scope expand? So for a third-party provider, if it's successful, they may win more work from that client. And what sort of financial investment is required, and how do we do that? Do we do that together? I know in some partnering relationships, the client supports the third-party provider with finance that they have at their fingertips to reduce the cost of equipment, vehicles, etc. that can be purchased. I remember that was done with Kalari and Bungie in the 1990s. So, as a summary, what we're talking about is type 1 partnership, type 2, type 3 or arm's length, and the level of effort you put into the components is determined by the value you're going to get. Okay, and that's something that the both organisations can then rank and implement based on the value. So we haven't spoken much about relationship yet, because obviously to get to this point there needs to be the development of relationship to such a degree where there's trust in both organisations, and obviously that's part of the facilitators. But strategic intent is very important if we're going to go into some sort of partnering relationship. So I've mentioned there aspects like capability, mindset. So, you know, do we have any experience in terms of being collaborative? The legal requirements, so we need to be very careful that the legal people don't take the process over and create an adversarial environment. The truth is that the relationship should be driven by the memorandum of understanding or the heads of agreement and not the other way around. The truth is that risk drives the legal eagles to almost create adversarial environments. So a real challenge for collaborative lawyers to get involved here and to get involved together early on with the project team. So then the collaborative agreement can be something that's congruent with the intention. Not something that happens a lot, but does exist. So what we've got is a methodology for delivering the value, and it can tell us where we need to start and who should be involved, because it may well be that for one party it's a type 3, but for another party it's a type 1, and that would help us allocate resources to the development of that value. And obviously we need those KPIs which we've mentioned. And we need to build this relationship capability. So in a lot of my work I do a number of simulations and a number of conversations to nurture relationship capability, and I'll speak about that now. So I've just given one example, one methodology that I've worked with, which was called Co-Sourcing Alliance. So we put together this idea of the first step is to build a healthy relationship between the client and the third-party provider, and much of that is how are we going to fight. And my philosophy is let's have one bunker, not two bunkers, when the problems arise, because there will always be problems, as there is in life. So after having those conversations about how we're going to deal and how we want to be with each other, we need to ask the question, are we still committed to this partnering relationship? But remember, it comes from building a healthy relationship already, and we have a heads of agreement that actually details a memorandum of understanding of how we're going to work together. So obviously the next bit in this partnering is to get the commercials right. So obviously the partnering workshop that we've just spoken about, I've conducted. You can see on the left-hand side there I run a simulation called Red Blue, which is a fantastic education tool for people who are focused on partnering, and I would encourage people to use it. I'm going to give you a link to my book which details Red Blue in detail, and I'm very happy to come and talk to people if they'd like to conduct it in their own organisations. But it's a fantastic tool to develop partnering capability and collaborative capability. So in here you can see that we're saying that we're going to build collaboratively, that means together, the client and the 3PL, a cost model that's transparent to both parties. We have the costs, real costs. It's an open book environment and real open book, not pretend. And there's only one set of books. Now to do that, the third party has to trust the client that they're not going to be abused. So we're actually we're breaking down a master-servant relationship to one where we can work as equals. So as I said, not for the faint-hearted. And this is an iterative process. It's not we get it right once and that's it. We're always working on it, always working on relationship, perhaps like our friendships and our intimate relationships. We can't just sign up and do nothing thereafter and expect everything to be right. So the last bit here is the successful implementation, which is obviously the most important part, and that's a continuous communication process. I do a lot of conflict capability work here and ensure people can resolve conflict without destroying the relationship, but we need it to be robust and we need it to be focused on the issue and not the person. And so much of my work is how to fight fair, and as I said, in one bunker, not two bunkers, and trusting each other that we can work it out no matter what happens. So I just provide this as a sort of picture of the transition from traditional contracts to more collaborative ones, and you can see some of these aspects are about the sort of information that's shared. And on the collaborative one, we're looking at a common picture of success. In the collaborative one, we tend to get to know each other more than just professionally. So we need to actually know each other so we can work with our strengths and weaknesses. And in any high performance environment, we actually consciously work with our weaknesses. It's very easy to work with our strengths. It's the stuff of champions who work with their weaknesses openly and actively. As I've spoken about, the third point is about conflict. The fourth one is about organisational aims. And so for successful partnering, we need to have clear intentions and joint strategic aims, and often joint values and behaviours in terms of how we're going to behave. Now the next one, Dan, is this idea about two bunkers versus one. What I realise is that people sometimes follow the rules in traditional contracts, but in collaborative ones, we actually know the rules that have to be broken. And that is a reality in collaborative environments because the organisational system is not geared for collaboration, it's geared for minimising risk. And if you minimise risk, you never take a chance. And so it is a different environment to be working in. There's a real challenge in terms of sharing confidential information. So in the collaborative, we tend to share much more, but we're far more conscious of what is really confidential. People involved in these third-party provider contracts, if you don't trust someone, you never take action and deliver work without having the dollars sorted out. But in a collaborative one, you trust that the commercials will be sorted out, and your challenge is to resolve operational issues for the client. And as long as that client then respects you as the provider of transport or warehousing and pays for it, then the relationship continues in a high trust environment that then enables the organisation to work in a seamless flow. I mentioned a little bit this second last one, which was master-servant relationship. We tell the third party or we tell the client, and there's limited interest in the other organisation, whereas in the partnering one, collaborative one, we're actually pursuing equality and we actually look after each other, and we care about whether someone's making a profit. And if they don't make a profit, that's not going to work. But we also don't charge too much and gouge. So there is a relationship that's quite mature about profit and margin. And the last one is whether we're in this sort of a win-lose or whether we're in a win-win relationship. And so they're the sorts of things that transition from traditional contracts to a more collaborative one. So, as I mentioned, for anyone interested, if they go to collaborativeinquiry.com, so that's a website that I have with my co-author Ian George, and there's a book there called From Me to We Design and Build Collaborative Workplaces. That highlights a 5-year partnering relationship with a group of 10 organisations that was certainly driven by inspirational leadership. So feel free to download a book, and it's free of charge, as I said, and there's some other content in there that may be of value to you, and certainly give me a call if you'd like anything clarified. So let's just sum up then. We're looking at the role partnering plays in a world-class supply chain over the past 3/4 of an hour. It needs inspirational leadership, and that can be developed. And with that leadership development, we can then look at who to partner with and why, and we can use this Partnership Facilitator's Guide to enable that process in a workshop environment and identify the value, and then look at the components in the relationship that enable us to deliver that full value. And as I mentioned, I'm very happy to support people if they want to fill out that inspirational leadership survey result and send me the results, and I can look at it and have a conversation with you over Skype free of charge. I'm also happy to come and talk about the partnering model free of charge if you see that as relevant. Often in these types of partnering relationships you need a third party who's independent of the two organisations, who can then hold each party accountable to the partnering pursuit that both organisations want. So with that, I'll hand over to Wendy if there's any questions. Very happy to take those.
No, Stephen, there is no questions. Everybody's been listening intently. So there was that, just that one email that I sent you earlier about what the expectation was from this webinar.
Yeah, and we have spoken about, that was from Dan, and we have spoken about developing that level of trust, and certainly in that example I provided of the co-sourcing, relationship development is the first step, and you would never step into a partnering process if you don't trust someone, but you need to work on it, and that's where I also offered that red-blue simulation for anyone who's interested, and if you download a copy of the book, there's a lot of detail in there about that red-blue environment. So are there any other questions? Otherwise we might call it an end.
No, that looks like it's for now, Stephen. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Wendy.
A big thank you is extended to Stephen. This is his 4th presentation. He does a wonderful job as usual. And we look forward to you all joining us for the next topic on Tuesday the 20th of September, Managing Flexible Work with Erin McCarthy from Piper Alderman. There will be a short survey that will appear on the screen after this webinar has completed. Thank you to all of those that take time to complete it now. If you have any ideas for future webinars or topics or speakers, please let me know. And have a wonderful weekend. Thank you for attending.